We are now live.
Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scher.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
And we are here tonight with an extra special podcast. We are coming to you live following the Republican presidential debate. We're super grateful for those of you who are joining us tonight as we break down this momentous event. For those of you joining after the fact, I'm jealous that you went to bed at a decent time because it's 10:15 and officially past our bedtimes. But we are powering through, fired up after an exciting 2-hour debate with 8 Republican candidates for president. We have 3 incredible panelists joining us tonight for this breakdown. First, we are start by welcoming back to the podcast Representative Walter Hudson. Representative Hudson first joined us back in April and is a rare second-time guest. As a reminder, Hudson was elected in 2022 and just completed his first session in the Minnesota House, serving the Albertville, Otsego, and St. Michael area. Next up is GOP strategist, operative, and personal friend John Rouleau. John and I first met while serving on the board of our local BPOU in St. Paul and now have baby boys who were born within a week of each other. John has long been active in Republican politics and currently serves as the executive director of the Minnesota Jobs Coalition. And our third panelist tonight is another friend who has spent a number of years as a pro in the Republican messaging and communications world, Preya Samsundar. Preya worked for the state party and recently spent nearly 5 years as the Midwest Regional Communications Director for the Republican National Committee. For full disclosure, Preya is currently working on behalf of Nikki Haley's presidential super PAC. Grab another cup of coffee and buckle up because we cannot wait to dive into the good, the bad, and maybe even the ugly tonight as we break down all things Republican presidential debate. As you follow along, we welcome you to head to X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, and share your thoughts with us by tagging us at BBBreakPod. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the show. So we are going to kick things off tonight. We are grateful for the 3 of you being with us. We're going to do a quick round robin with brief introductions and your initial 2-ish minutes on what you thought of the debate comments, and then we'll dive into the weeds after this. Representative Hudson, will you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I come from a background in grassroots activism. I've been involved in and around the party for about 15 years since the advent of the Tea Party. And it's my first term as a state representative. And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm bringing to this. And, my short first impression of how the debate went tonight is you had one job, guys. You had one job, and your job was to demonstrate to Republican primary voters that Donald Trump should not be the nominee in 2024. And they didn't even try, from what I saw, to make that case, which is a really bizarre thing to be saying in the aftermath of a unique opportunity to elevate any one of their campaigns by knocking out the guy who's in the front end.
Great. John.
Well, thanks for having me on. Watching that debate, it really was kind of interesting to see the different route that it went. To build a little bit on what Representative Hudson said, it took 57 minutes before Donald Trump came up on that debate. That is when they got around they came back from that commercial break, got to the first question about Donald Trump. Really, looking at kind of heading into the debate, I think Governor DeSantis really had the highest stakes in that debate. I think tonight he needed to have opportunity to show donors, to show the grassroots that his campaign was still worth being behind. He's a guy who had a lot of hype before he got into the race. He had a lot of hype, kind of getting out into the front, raised a lot of money. And I think in a series of kind of missteps leading up to the debate, he really had a lot to live up to. And I'll be curious to see if you guys think that he met that match when we get around to discussing it a little bit more.
And Preya.
Thanks. This debate is the first real opportunity for Americans across the country to take a first real hard look at all of these candidates and for really Republicans to make that case that not only are they the best candidate to beat Joe Biden next November, but this is also their opportunity to make the case that they are the candidate to take on Donald Trump. Obviously, We had 2 hours to take a look and watch these candidates talk about a number of issues, all the way from UFOs to the border to the economy and foreign policy. And we saw a lot of things happen. And obviously, we'll get into that a little bit later. But overall, I think this was a good, real opportunity for Americans. I'm very excited to see what the overall conversation looks like over the next couple of days. But there were clear winners and losers tonight.
Well, before we get into the winners and losers, let's take a tip from the moderators here. Quick raise of hands if you think the moderators did a better job than they normally do. Oh, no hands going up. Oh, okay. Okay. We got some
No hands.
50-50s. All right. Well, maybe we'll get into that a little bit more. So, Preya, you set us up perfectly. We're going to start off with the winners tonight. We're going to go around the horn and let's discuss who everybody thought the top 3 candidates are following the debate, or who performed the best in the debate, who came out on top, exceeded expectations, had key moments, and just overall proved them as a quality candidate tonight. John, let's start with you.
Yeah. Debates are, a lot of series of little moments that kind of build up, and it's something that you can take away with you. And I think sometimes the winners are the people who don't have any of those at all. So tonight, my 3 winners, I think, might be a little bit of a surprise to people, but I'm going to say that Nikki Haley had a great night. I think that she really kind of rose to the moment. But my other 2 winners are 2 people who weren't on that stage, and it's Donald Trump and it's Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the incumbent Democratic president that all of these folks want to run against. And frankly, they spent more time arguing and bickering amongst themselves than they did holding him accountable for his failed record, for the inflation that is out of control and remains out of control, for the crime that still is much higher than it was when he took office. And I think that he basically made it out of this debate unscathed, and didn't see anybody who showed that they could really hold him accountable for his failed record.
All righty. Preya, your thoughts on the top 3?
Obviously, as Becky kind of mentioned, I do work for the Nikki Haley super PAC, but I will say, even as somebody who does work for her, I would say that she did come out on top. And I think anyone who was watching this debate would absolutely agree. She had so many key moments. I mean, that opening line where she just came out swinging at not only the people on that debate stage, but at Donald Trump as well. If you notice throughout the 2-hour debate, there were a number of opportunities where we saw Chris Christie, Asa Hutchins take swings at Donald Trump, and they got booed. Nikki Haley is the only candidate on that stage tonight who took swings at Donald Trump on multiple occasions and was applauded. And I think that is something that folks need to keep an eye on, because if we're talking about that, this presidential debate being one that is kicking off a series of opportunities for these candidates to show the American people that they have what it takes to take on Joe Biden and Donald Trump next November. And it's when we start the caucuses and the primary process come January. Nikki Haley did a very good job making that case tonight. I would also argue that Mike Pence did a much better than expected job tonight. I think when you think about Mike Pence, and when I worked at the RNC back in 2020, I had the opportunity to see Mike Pence on the campaign trail. You kind of see a more docile figure, I guess is probably a good word to describe him. He's very soft-spoken, very quiet. You don't really expect him to kind of get his hackles up, and that's exactly what he did tonight. He went after Vivek on a number of occasions. He wasn't afraid to push back, and that's something we haven't seen from Mike Pence before. So that was a very interesting turn. Again, I'm trying to be quite honest, struggling to figure out who that third person was. I think there are a lot of losers on that debate stage tonight. So I'll keep it to my top 2 because I can't even think of a third one at the moment.
We'll take it. Representative.
Well, to add some credibility to Preya's take, I will say that Nikki Haley is on my list. She's not on the first position, though. We'll get to her in order. So the top of my list, and I'll explain my reasoning here. And let me just say at the outset, I don't think anybody on that debate stage tonight was like a dramatic standout who did extraordinarily better than anybody else. Overall, it was a very underwhelming 2 hours from my perspective. But we got to come up with a top three, right? So my number one would be Vivek Ramaswamy. And the reason why is because I think from the perspective of the average Republican primary voter who's just starting to tune into the process now, he accomplished the mission of putting his name in people's heads. Like, people responded very enthusiastically and emotionally to a lot of the messaging that he had on offer, which was a very Trump-like kind of populist message about how average, normal, productive, and virtuous people are being left behind under the Biden economy and under Bidenomics. He did not, he failed he wasn't consistent throughout his performance, especially in fending off a lot of the attacks that came his way by the likes of Mike Pence. But I think he did potentially gain the most from any of the candidates on the debate stage tonight. My number two would be DeSantis. And I would love to be able to say that it's because he blew me away with his messaging, and he was on point and he was really impressive tonight. The reason why he's my number two is because he didn't do any damage to himself. Like, I think that he is in exactly the same place coming out of this that he was going into it, which is not what he needed. That should not have been his goal, but he at least achieved that, and so good on him. And my number three would be Nikki Haley, because, you know, and going into this, Nikki Haley is not on my radar as somebody who I have, with apologies to Preya, any intention or interest in supporting for the Republican nomination. And that's what impresses me, is that in spite of that, she made points tonight that caught my attention, that had me nodding and agreeing with her and respecting her experience and what she had to say. And she was a competent contender on that debate stage. I think of all the candidates, she demonstrated the best debate proficiency, which certainly counts for something.
All right, and my illustrious co-host, Michael, what do you think on the top three performances tonight?
Number one, I think that the top performance tonight on the stage, I got to go with Nikki Haley. I was impressed by her performance tonight. I was impressed by her debate style and her depth of the issues and her willingness to push back. I think was good contrast with the other candidates. I think Donald Trump was also, who wasn't on the stage tonight, I think he was a big winner. I agree with Representative Hudson that overall, I think there was a little bit of underwhelming, to say the least, on some of the overall debate. I think Trump cast a pretty big shadow over the debate tonight. And so I think he was a big winner because he wasn't there. I would also say that I'm a big fan of Chris Christie. He did a good job in terms of poking and framing up the debate. He's shown himself to be a real scrappy fighter. I have concerns about his longevity in terms of issues, and can he be a candidate other than the anti-Trump foil? But those three candidates are the ones that I think, two that were on the stage, one that wasn't, that I think won tonight. I'll have more to say when we get to those who didn't win, but that's my perspective right now, and very insightful comments from all of you. And I benefited from going last, so thank you for that opportunity.
Well, hey, I'll throw mine in as well, and I gotta say, Michael.
I'm sorry, Becky. That's right.
Usually you're a rule follower here, and you threw out like a John did, the Trump Biden thing. I mean, this was about who participated, but I'll give you guys a pass. We'll come back and chat about that after we get to the losers. I'm gonna double down, unanimous for all five of us here. Haley crushed it, came out swinging. I think she really, obviously, as the only woman on the stage, really showed herself on women's issues and being a voice for women and suburban women who we really need, across the country to come out and come over to the red side. I think she did great. I think she did also a really good job. I was really impressed with how she worked to differentiate herself from the congressional and administrative Republicans, who she kind of, made sure to tie into what Biden was passing, what the Democrats in Congress were passing. So I've always been a fan, but she really, really crushed it tonight. Chris Christie is someone who I've long been a fan of. I think he did a good job. His usual sassy self, showing he's certainly a not Trumper. And so I think that he had some really good attack lines there. And then for number 3, I thought that I was going to be the rule breaker here a little bit by having almost a tie for my number 3. If I have to do a number 3, I'm going to give it a tie to Pence and Burgum. I think Burgum really, he didn't get a whole lot of speaking time, but I think he did kind of step up when he had the mic. So, Michael, you got something to say?
I forgot he was on the stage. He had such an underwhelming performance. It's surprising, but go ahead. I want to, I forget that we're on camera now, so people can see my reaction. So
you're going
to see the normal smirking and eye rolling that I do a lot of times, generally confined to the food takes. But I forgot that I gotta have a little bit of a poker face because we're live tonight.
Before we get into the losers, I want to throw it to Representative Hudson or Preya and see, John, one of his winners that he called out was President Biden. Do you think that with the performance of the 8 Republicans on the stage tonight, Biden did, did come out as a winner of the debate?
I can go if you
go for
want. Honestly, I don't think this debate was about Biden. I think in the long term, it is going to be about Biden, and ultimately the goal is to beat Biden. But I think this first debate, is about introducing these 8 candidates to the American people. We have to realize, all of us are from Minnesota here, so let's take a second and realize we have 3 months of great weather here in the Midwest. Folks are at their cabins every weekend. They're at the lake. They're spending time with family. They're going on vacations. Right now, we're getting ready for back to school. We're getting ready for the state fair to start up. Folks aren't paying attention. They haven't been paying attention all year. This is the first real opportunity that Americans are going to have an opportunity to see these candidates at face value and hear exactly what they stand for, what they don't. And they don't need to hear so much about Joe Biden because Joe Biden does plenty of that on his own. Okay. We know that he spent a third of his presidency on vacation. That's not an issue that we need to contend with. People see it every week. They go to the gas station and they see that gas prices are at a 10-month high. They go to the grocery store and see that eggs are expensive again. Milk is expensive. Bread is expensive. They don't need to be told that. They already know that. They know that they're spending more on bills and groceries and food and rent and mortgage. They know that they can't buy a home because the Fed keeps hiking the interest rate up. They see all of these things. They don't need to be told what they already know. It's like living in an echo chamber. What they need to know is what these different candidates can offer to them. And that is what the goal of tonight was. It was about differentiating themselves from one another and about creating an opportunity to stand out from the rest. That is what tonight was about. It wasn't about Joe Biden. It was about them.
I'll broaden the premise of the question a little bit. And first, I'll answer directly and say that I think that the only way that Joe Biden potentially could have lost in any meaningful way tonight would have been if one of the candidates had demonstrated effectively that Donald Trump should not be the nominee in 2024, because I think that the best chance that Joe Biden has of being reelected, assuming that he is the Democrat nominee, is if he's going head to head with Donald Trump. And I think there's a lot of objective analysis to back that up. And so from Joe Biden's perspective, really the only way this night could have gone poorly for him is if somebody had taken a real big bite out of Trump's dominance in this primary field. And I don't think that was achieved. I think that was the primary job that all these candidates had when they showed up tonight, was to demonstrate that Donald Trump, the front runner by quite a margin, should not be the nominee. Secondarily, for everybody not named DeSantis on that stage, their job was to demonstrate that he shouldn't be the candidate either. And I did not feel as though any of them, like I said, DeSantis was my number 2 in the top 3, simply because I felt like he did no harm and he endured no harm. He's in exactly the same position now as I see it as he was going in tonight. And of course, the third objective would be to take a bite out of Joe Biden. But again, I feel as though that's linked to the first job, which is taking a bite out of Donald Trump, and that didn't happen tonight.
Well, I think go
For
ahead.
me, when I look at this, a lot of this is about tactics, right? And in Republican primaries, we see candidates run to the right of each other all the time, right? And it's an attempt to see who can appeal to the base the most. And my theory is, and always will be, that the best way to be the most conservative candidate on that stage is to be more conservative than the Democrat that you're running against and hold them accountable. You can start to act as if that is your opponent, because long term, that is going to be your opponent. So you don't necessarily have to be more conservative than DeSantis on an issue or Vivek on an issue. If you can go and say, this is where Joe Biden has failed, and you start to really sell the conservative narrative about that, instead of so often in Republican races, we get bogged down in arguing over the last 5%. And we want to go and, we see it even down at the BPOU level, right? We're passing resolutions and we're debating, does this word here mean this? And, we're talking about our platform. And really, this was an opportunity for folks to get out there and show that they have the ability to lead, the ability to stand up to Joe Biden, the ability to stand up to Donald Trump. And the way that you can convince people that you're presidential is by acting presidentially. And I think that going against Biden is a great way to do that. And I think that was a missed opportunity.
Michael.
I want to ask the panel here, ask the group that we have here, what do you think, what should have been the approach of the candidates on the stage tonight about Donald Trump and him not being on stage? There was a direct question asked. They describe it as kind of the elephant in the room. But what should have been the candidate's role or response to the fact that Donald Trump wasn't there?
I think that someone this would have been an extremely risky move, what I'm about to describe. But I think it has the virtue of being necessary. Okay. You need to make the case that Donald Trump cannot win in 2024. You need to make the case, and you need to do it in such a way that it doesn't come off as you attacking Donald Trump or lending credence or credibility to those who are engaged in what some have described as the lawfare attacks against him. And that's a very difficult, small needle to thread, but it is a necessary component if you're going to make the case that Donald Trump shouldn't be the nominee. The only grounds that I see on which you can make that case is this guy will not become the next president of the United States. He will not be reelected because the unique circumstances that he finds himself in, regardless of the merits of the indictments and what you think about the political motivations of them, there's a very high chance that he's not even going to be on the ballot in multiple states, because these secretaries of state are going to take the opportunity based upon whatever their state laws happen to be to make the claim that he's not qualified to be on their ballots. How can you have a Republican nominee for president who isn't on the ballot? And so it would have been difficult for somebody to make that case. I don't know if the case I just made, the way I just articulated it, would go over particularly well in that room. But it is a tough truth, a hard truth that folks on our side need to be willing to hear. And it's an analysis that's completely independent of how you feel about Donald Trump. It's just a cold, hard electoral reality.
Others that want to answer.
I guess I can go next. To Representative Hudson's point, you talk about how it's going to go over in that room. I think we did see how it goes over in that room when you go a little too far to the left and hit Donald Trump a little too hard. We saw that with Asa Hutchinson. We saw that with Chris Christie. They got booed very loudly. And I can tell you, I've been to Iowa. I lived there. That room was not filled with 100% Trump supporters, but it definitely sounded like it when they started booing. You have to realize that the Democrats gave Donald Trump the greatest gift on planet Earth when they indicted him 4 times, because they made him a martyr. And when you make that argument about secretaries of state taking him off the ballot because of his legal problems, you're furthering that martyrdom, because it's not going to be red states that are going to be taking him off the ballot. It's going to be Illinois and Minnesota and Wisconsin and all of these blue states. And Donald Trump is going to point his finger and say, look at the big bad Democrats. Look at them trying to rig this election. Look at what they're doing to me. They did it in 2016. They're trying to do it again in 2020, and they're doing it again in 2024. It only adds fuel to the flame. So you definitely can't go that route. I think Nikki Haley probably did the best job in trying to make that claim tonight, because she actually came out and said it's about electability, and he cannot get elected.
John?
Yeah, I mean, it's the impossible question to answer, right? You've got, we're operating in kind of a, post-reality world. And how do you make an argument about that when 70% of Donald Trump's voters believe that he is the only one who tells them the truth, that he is, trusted by over 30% more than these folks' religious leaders, right? That they believe Donald Trump is more likely to tell them the truth than their pastor. If you had told me that was going to be the Republican primary electorate a decade ago, that pastors would be less trusted than a politician from New York, I would have thought you were crazy. But they trust him 10 points more than their family members. So making that argument really requires you to find a way to do it in a way where he can't come back and say they're lying to you, because that's the answer. And frankly, I think tonight, what I would have done if I was one of those advising a candidate on that stage would be to say to use Donald Trump's words against him. There's a long track record of Donald Trump goading people into debating, calling people who don't debate weak, calling them cowards, talking about how only losers don't debate. And frankly, that's the route that I would have gone, is using his own words against him, preferably with video, so that people can't say that you just made it up. But that's, again, a very hard thing to do on the stage, and it's probably best left to a super PAC rather than a campaign and a candidate on that stage.
I do want to come back to Trump a little bit later, but do want to make sure that we kind of circle us back to the performances on the debate stage tonight, and let's go into with the good comes the bad, right? So we're going to do another round robin here, this time with everybody who they thought were in the bottom 3, who missed opportunities, who struggled with facts, couldn't articulate themselves in a manner that a top-tier presidential candidate needs to do. This time, let's start with Preya.
Okay, so I actually have 3 for this one. So first of all, I would say DeSantis. This was a huge missed opportunity for him after, I think we're on reboot number 6, 7 of his campaign. This was kind of his moment to show not only his supporters, but more importantly, the donors that are backing his campaign, that he has what it takes to take on Donald Trump, and he couldn't take on the 7 other candidates on that debate stage. I think out of the 2 hours that I watched that full debate, I forgot he was on that debate stage half of the time. He was unmemorable. It was pretty forgettable. And the arguments that he did make were so-so. In fact, I think I have to go back and look and see if he flip-flopped on Ukraine again, because he's done it so many times. It was a very poor showing on DeSantis's part, and he did nothing to instill confidence in the donors that he has left or in his supporters that he has what it takes to take on Joe Biden, much less Donald Trump, much less anybody else on that stage. Number 2, Vivek Ramaswamy. He came into that debate hot. on a little bit of a bump there. Obviously, he's been stumbling the last few days on his foreign policy. And I think Nikki Haley had the best line of the night. She said he knows absolutely nothing about foreign policy, and it shows. Mike Pence made several comments about his age and the fact that he has no real resume. I mean, he just kind of walked into this debate as a hotshot, frankly, with a little bit too much of an ego for the limited resume that he has. And it kind of rubbed everyone the wrong way, and they attacked him for it, and rightfully so. And I think he just showed that he was not qualified to be in that top seat. He probably needed to run for local office first before deciding that he was qualified to be president of the United States. But that's a whole different conversation. And finally, I have to say, Chris Christie was the one that I was also really disappointed in. He was directly asked about the Trump indictments and Trump not being on that stage tonight. And this was an opportunity for him to go all in on something that he has said is his sole mission as a presidential candidate, to take on Donald Trump and to knock him out of the polls. And he completely whiffed on that. He wasn't as strong as he usually is on that question. It was kind of unforgettable, and it was really disappointing, considering that is kind of the whole mission of his presidential campaign, is to take down Donald Trump, and he did not do it when given the prime opportunity. It was a softball, and he missed.
All right. Now I'm going to throw it over to Representative Hudson, and I want you to also give us your bottom three here, but also if you want to have any responses. I know that two of Preya's bottom three were in your top three, so let's hear from you on that as well.
Well, I appreciate that latitude. I was going to let that pass, but since you've opened up the path for me to respond, I'll try to thread that in there. First of all, I'll just say that at the risk of sounding like I'm kissing up to our hosts, Brodkorb and Becky, you guys put together a good panel tonight. If for no other reason, then you're going to get a diversity of response, a spectrum of opinion here, because my bottom three are very different, and in the order from the third worst to the absolute worst. I would say Mike Pence was third from the bottom, which is about where I would have expected him to end up. I didn't think that he did a terrible job tonight. In fact, I really respect his commitment to his positions, even as I disagree with them. I mean, the guy's consistent in terms of what he says he believes and his willingness to say it to an audience of people that he knows is going to boo him for it. That speaks to character, but I don't think he did himself any favors tonight by doing that. I don't know who his audience is or what he thinks his path is to the Republican nomination for president or what he's even doing in this race. From there, it gets even worse. Asa Hutchinson, it's hard to understand how he is. I mean, you got to give him credit. He is an elected governor of a state in the union, so he must have some political acumen. But I don't understand how a guy like that gets nominated, endorsed, put forward as a Republican candidate for anything. He sounds very weak on all the issues that are of utmost importance to those in the grassroots. And I think even, folks who are kind of apolitical and concerned about workaday issues. And last would be Doug Burgum, because Doug Burgum was my Chris Christie in terms of, Preya said she didn't even really notice he was there. That's kind of how I felt about Doug Burgum. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know why he's doing this other than maybe to just elevate his name ID for some potential future prospects. But I can't recall a single thing that he said tonight. It was just that unremarkable. As far as Vivek, listen, I don't think that, I think the criticisms that Preya raises regarding Vivek Ramaswamy, there's some legitimacy for sure in his kind of unearned swagger. I think he does conduct himself with a fair amount of unearned swagger. And that certainly there's a market for that, right? There's an audience for that, which I think explains how he's been described as having this meteoric rise in the polls. And I think that does play into it. But there's only Donald Trump can do Donald Trump. And Vivek is kind of coming across as like the poor man's Donald Trump, which, if that's what you want, you're just going to vote for Donald Trump, right? Like, I don't understand what the the market is there. Again, kind of similar to the other candidates of what is it that who's the imaginary Republican voter who you think is going to take you over this guy who you're trying to emulate. But like I said, the reason why he's in my top 3 and indeed number 2 is because I think overall his performance tonight resulted in the greatest elevation of his candidacy. So if nothing else, if not in the polls, we'll see, certainly in the minds of those Republican primary voters who were tuning in.
Fantastic. And John, over to you.
Yeah. So, presidential races more than any other race, I think really come down to what I'll call vibes, right? It's the general vibe of the candidate who is out there, and it's about hanging around long enough to see if what you're saying starts to resonate a little bit and try and grab onto that moment and get it to happen at the right time. And when we look at debates, Roger Ailes had the orchestra pit theory. James Carville described it and said that the press likes to talk about scandals, gaffes, polls, and attacks. And I think coming out of tonight, somebody who had some gaffes and is in my bottom 3 is Vivek. I think that he came in on a heater. He was rising. Interestingly, he's rising a lot more online. I think some of that can obviously be attributed to his age, to his supporters, but he does significantly better in surveys that are conducted online. And I think he's running a very online campaign, if I could kind of put it that way. But what struck me is that it was a lot of sound bites. It was a lot of chasing that one moment. But there's not a whole lot under the surface. And I think some of that comes from the inexperience. Some of that comes from maybe being a little bit overconfident. But it really struck me that Democratic populism and Republican populism sound a lot alike. And you could see that when he stole President Obama's debate line when he gave the introduction and talked about the skinny kid standing in the middle with a weird sounding last name or a funny sounding last name. You could see it when he stole Sarah Palin's drill baby drill. And I think when the voters continue to look at it, they're going to see it when they find out that he stole Bernie Sanders' death tax plan and wants a death tax at 60%. So I think that there's a lot there where people start to scratch that surface. I think Nikki Haley scratched the surface on him, that Mike Pence scratched the surface on him. And I think that tonight he kind of exposed himself that when those punches start to fly, I don't think that there's going to be much there to back them up. So I think I have him in my kind of losers bucket because of that, just because he showed that there's a soft opening underneath that armor. I've got Ron DeSantis in my losers bucket, and honestly, for very similar reasons that Representative Hudson had him in his winners bucket. And I think that it was kind of a game samer moment for him. He did no harm, but he didn't do any good either. And I think heading into tonight, the expectations were so high on a reset for Governor DeSantis that he needed to not do no harm tonight. He needed to have a moment. He needed to have a good night. I was actually texting with a donor friend of mine from New York City who's very plugged in with the major donor community, the folks who initially were talking about writing those 7-figure checks to his super PAC. And folks are looking to see, they're waiting to see some sort of a moment. And I think his super PAC aired in when they put out the debate prep materials on their website. And they really painted Governor DeSantis into a really, really tough spot. They said that he needed to attack Vivek. They said that he needed to stand up to Chris Christie, that he needed to defend Donald Trump. And they said that he needed to have a humanizing moment where he could show that he's likable, that he's not robotic. And frankly, if he had told a great story tonight, right, something about his kids or his wife or something where he gets humanized, all of a sudden the question is, did you do that because your super PAC told you that you needed to be a human? And it was really a no-win situation for him. But I think, kind of not hitting it out of the park translates to a loss. It reminds me a lot of Governor Walker, who's somebody who I liked. I supported Governor Walker when he ran in 2016 initially. I think he dropped out, what was it, shortly after that second debate there. But a guy who was well funded, had a massive campaign footprint, was very built up around the grassroots, wanted to go door to door, and just dropped a ton of money and got too big too quick. And kind of, the whole plan wasn't necessarily scalable. And I see shades of that with Governor DeSantis. And my third loser, I will say, unfortunately for me, I'm going to put Tim Scott in that bucket. I really like Senator Scott. I think that he represents kind of the Republican Party that I remember when I was starting to get involved. Very much kind of a traditional Republican, a conservative. He's got the voting record to match it. He, ideologically, I think is kind of where the home of the party was from 2004 to 2015 or so. And I think he was one of those guys who I forgot was on stage. I thought that he had a couple of chances where he made good points where people were probably nodding along with him, but his presence was just I think that when I haven't gone through and tallied up how much time he had to speak, but I've got to imagine that he was in the bottom half of that bucket. And I just don't think he took advantage, but whether or not that hurts him long term remains to be seen. We've got a friend who likes to say survive and advance. And I think that, he may have survived. And I think he's somebody whose message could really resonate well in Iowa.
Before we get to you, Michael, I do have it up of who spoke the most, and I'll run through that real quick. Starting from the top, Pence got 2.5 minutes, Ramaswamy got 11:47, Christie 11:22, DeSantis 10:22, Haley 8:41, which is surprising, bottom half, all of our top threes. Scott got 8:15, Burgum 8 minutes, and Hutchinson 7:33, which is just under half of what Mike Pence did. Michael, over to you.
First of all, let me say I think there were too many candidates on stage, and that was frustrating to me. I think it would be good going forward if there was. I think it would be good for the RNC to have a higher threshold for candidates because I think there were just some distractions tonight. Until John brought up Tim Scott, I watched the whole debate. I forgot he was on stage, and so I would kind of have two groups of people that I don't think succeeded in it. I think Tim Scott, Hutchinson, and Burgum just did not do anything to advance their cause tonight. But of the main contenders that I think, I'm going to go with this number one, DeSantis. I think that he had a real missed opportunity tonight, and I think he's in a tough spot. He's been the main opponent of the former president. He's really in a tough spot. I just don't think tonight's format, with the number of candidates there and the expectations on him, I think he exceeded expectations as to how poor he could do. And so I just don't think he did enough to advance the ball. Pence, I just think there's not a place for his candidacy. I just don't think there's a place for his candidacy. I think based on his performance tonight, I think he's going to try to appeal to evangelicals in this race. There's just not enough excitement. I think, and based on how Trump has kind of, I think, amped up the party, I just don't think there's any platform or any ticket long-term for Pence to stay in this race. Vivek came across, and I don't know in what order these are, if he's the bottom of the three or the top of the three, depending how you look at the list. I think he came across very unlikable. And I know this isn't a popularity contest, and politics isn't a popularity contest, but in terms of the candidates that I kind of just had kind of a bad reaction to, I agree with Representative Hudson. I think he is trying to do Trump. And there's only one candidate in this race that can do Trump, and that's Trump. I think that Vivek is very quickly becoming the least popular candidate on stage, and that might be his shtick, and that might be what he wants to do. But I just don't think long-term there's much depth there. And so those are the three that I have. But again, from a process standpoint, I sure would like to see the RNC have a higher standard going forward so we can wean out some of these candidates. I mean, no disrespect to some of the other minor candidates around the race, but let's just be candid amongst the five of us that we should just maybe have a debate where we got some real people that are in the race. And I think any time that was spent on this race, no disrespect to Tim Scott or Hutchinson or Burgum, that's just a waste in the process. And I think the RNC should look at a smaller debate going forward with higher standards to get in, and then we can have a more thoughtful conversation and provide some real contrast with some of the other candidates.
All right. Kind of following suit, I have some repeat offenders here in my bottom three. I'll rattle them off relatively quickly. I don't have a ton new to add. Starting with Hutchinson, didn't get enough time, was too quiet. I will say when he did speak, he did sound genuine and authentic. I do believe that he really truly cares and wants to do better for the party and the country. I just don't see the fight in him. Tim Scott, I was really had high hopes. I think that he's a great voice for the Republican Party. I don't know if he was trying to overcompensate and run furthest to the right, but I felt there were times where he was trying to outflank the rest on this stage and really be that furthest right candidate up there. I did enjoy his closing. Good say, if you're in Iowa, vote for me, go to my website, donate. Love a good plug, good comm staffer dream there. And DeSantis, I think it was his to lose, and I think he lost it. I think that I'm not really a fan, except for an open and closing of doing the straight to camera and not looking at the moderators or folks in the room. He did that, kind of came across little crazy eyes. And I am all about a pivot, and I'll come back to that later because I think there were some really great pivots. I actually tweeted about one of Christie's. But I don't think he answered half the questions that he was asked, and I thought that was really frustrating. So those are my bottom threes. Real quick before we move on, any comments anybody wants to throw out against anybody else's or general rebuttals?
I have one question, and I'd be curious what the panel thinks. We talk a lot about tickets getting punched who got the momentum. I wonder who potentially after this debate, are we at a point in this race where all of the candidates that are on stage, does anyone get out? Did any candidacies end tonight? Because I don't think anyone's candidacies ended tonight. I do think some should, but I don't know if I don't know if there were any critical mistakes that were made that's going to end someone. I do think some should end, but I don't know. I think all of them stand, but I'm curious if anyone else had a perspective. If someone's performance was so bad tonight, they need to get out.
I generally agree with your analysis. I mean, I'm going to hold back a little bit for our next question in terms of the details, but suffice it to say for now, those are two different questions. Who should get out versus who will get out. I don't think anybody who should get out was provided the motivation tonight to actually execute and pull the trigger and get out of the race.
Yeah, I don't think we saw anything that it's an immediate, campaign ender. But I do think that we started to see some things that will likely trickle down. And presidential campaigns don't end because you're done running. They end because you run out of money. They end because you've fallen so far in the polls. And I think it's a slower burn, but I think we saw the start of that with some campaigns tonight that I think we'll start to see that they need to tighten up the belt and figure out if they can reset and get back into this thing.
Well, I know he wasn't on the debate stage tonight, but I know a lot of folks are waiting to see whether Suarez keeps to his word and actually drops out now that he didn't make the debate stage. So clock's ticking on that one.
His announcement that he didn't make the stage looked a lot like a concession to me, where he closed it out with, "I intend to help whoever the Republicans pick beat Joe Biden." So
well, he's got to make it a little bit more clear to the press.
I think we can see that one probably coming pretty soon.
All right. Well, this kind of goes along with our next one. We're going to talk about, in general, state of the race. I am going to make a plug. We're going to talk specifically about Trump here after this question, but we'll want to hit on, like I said, overall state of the race as it stands today, post-debate now. Will we see changes in the polls, and which way? who, if anybody, well, we just answered that one. Nobody's going to drop out that we know of right now. And how does Trump react and retaliate? Who is he going to take swings at? This one, Representative Hudson, I'm going to throw it to you.
My one word reaction to tonight is nothing burger. It will be as if tonight did not happen, because nothing meaningful or impactful or lasting occurred tonight for a variety of reasons. The various performances, the lack of Donald Trump present on the stage, but most curiously of all, as we've already discussed at length, the fact that so few candidates took the opportunity to make the case why the guy who's far and away in the lead shouldn't ultimately be the nominee on the Republican side for president of the United States. If you're not going to do that, then what's the point? I feel, going back to the points that were made earlier regarding just the number of people on stage and having a higher standard and a bigger threshold for getting on stage in the first place, I think that kind of raises the question of, from the RNC's perspective, and there's a broader ecosphere than just the RNC that determines these things, but what is it that the various interests are trying to achieve? And the answer to that doesn't seem to be producing a nominee that will defeat Joe Biden. At this stage, the goal seems to be a lot of other stuff, a lot of like business stuff of let's have let's have more people on the stage because it's more dynamic and we can potentially have more interesting clips that we can farm out and kind of gin up interest in the primary as a product. And this primary isn't a product. This primary is a function by which we're going to determine who we're putting forward to meet a moment that needs to be met. I mean, I've spent a lot of time today, and folks listening up to this point could be forgiven for assuming that I'm rehashing my 2016 stance against the presidential candidacy of Donald Trump. That's not what's happening at all. I'm merely stating the observation that the only point of having this process, with the polls being what they are, is to demonstrate that he shouldn't be the nominee. If you're not going to do that, then there's no point in having this process, and it's all a giant distraction, and all of the money that's being spent on it would be better spent developing a campaign and electoral ballot gathering operation that's actually going to lead to victory in 2024. And so, I think the overall result of this is that nothing really has changed. Trump is still going to be in the lead. If I was advising Trump, I'd tell him to do exactly what he did tonight. Pretend it didn't even happen. There's no point in responding to anything. There's no point in retaliating against anyone. To give anybody oxygen by addressing them directly, and I would include DeSantis in this at this point, is only benefiting the person that you're attacking and doing nothing for your candidacy whatsoever. He can actually, unlike Vivek, he has earned swagger. He can actually conduct himself moving forward with swagger, because with this being the trajectory, he is going to be the nominee. And by the way, the rest of us need to figure out how to deal with that. Like, if there is one, I'll edit my initial kind of headline just this much. What should change tonight is not what any of the campaigns necessarily are doing, other than the ones that should be getting out, but it's what the rest of us should be doing. A lot of us were looking at tonight for an indication that the poll positions were going to change, that there was going to be somebody who could potentially give Trump a run for his money and potentially be the next Republican nominee for president. It seems very clear to me at this point that, absent some titanic unforeseen shift between now and once we get into the caucus and primary actual votes being cast next year, Trump's going to be the nominee. And so that reality is something that the rest of the conservative Republican ecosphere needs to become, if not comfortable with, certainly develop their strategies around and learn how to accept and work with.
All right, Mr. Rouleau.
Yeah, I think, pretty much in agreement that the state of the race is relatively unchanged. I think this far out, though, it is important to remember that we don't have a national primary, right? Just like we don't have a national presidential election. We have 50 states that are going to host a combination of primaries and caucuses. The results of those, the RNC rule changes, we have a lot of binding of delegates and binding of delegates in unique ways. I think that we're too far out to really know what that's going to shake out and look like. I think that I still think that I could see someone like Tim Scott doing really well in Iowa. That's a state that kind of has bucked conventional wisdom. They tend to really like kind of a more traditional conservative. Right now, Governor DeSantis has a absolute ton of the support from electeds and from county chairmen and things of that sort in Iowa. I'll be curious if that holds. But Tim Scott is absolutely in the mold of what Iowa likes, kind of in the lines of Mike Huckabee, in the lines of Rick Santorum, people who have done very well in Iowa. And that's really going to be the first test, right? Followed by North Carolina or New Hampshire, and then Nevada, and then we move into Super Tuesday. So we've got a while before before January gets here for Iowa, and February and March get here for everybody else. We've got at least another debate in the next month. But I think for tonight, very, very little changes except for, hopefully some strategy on these campaigns. I don't know that anybody really should be looking in the mirror outside of maybe a very limited number of the candidates and nodding and saying what we did worked, let's keep doing it. I'll be very curious if Governor Haley is able to get a boost based on tonight. I think that it was most likely a tactical decision that everybody was ganging up on Vivek. I know that I saw people saying that, maybe people don't like him. Maybe he seems cocky. Maybe he seems smarmy. He's the guy who was on the rise and I think was pulling voters likely from DeSantis. And those voters who had moved from DeSantis to Vivek, I think that, those are the free agents. So people I think saw a target that was, ripe for the picking. And I'll be very curious if Governor Haley is able to capture any of those voters. And if anything reshuffles a little bit. But I think looking at the polls is, I don't want to confuse the interesting with the important, right? The polls are interesting to watch, but I don't think that they're that important at this stage. And I think folks need to continue to spend their time on the ground, having those grassroots conversations, going door to door, but also raising their money because, as I mentioned before, presidential campaigns end because you run out of money. And I think that they need to make sure that they've got gas in the tank to make it to Iowa.
Preya, you're up.
I think I kind of agree with everyone in the sense that, Donald Trump is not going to suddenly drop from the sky and be second, third place. But I also think you're going to see a reshuffling of these other candidates who are running to be that answer to, if not Trump, then who? And I think Nikki Haley definitely made that case tonight that she is that candidate to take on Donald Trump. I think it was really telling right before the debates. Politico did a story in Playbook. They reached out to Biden's brain trust, as they call him, I think that's funny to begin with, that he has a brain trust, but that's a different conversation for another day. They reached out to the brain trust and asked who they were most afraid of, and it was Nikki Haley. That is who they're most afraid of. And I think tonight she demonstrated exactly why they're terrified of her. I think when we look to Iowa and New Hampshire, I've talked with a lot of reporters, okay? And it's very easy to tell who spent time in Iowa, New Hampshire, and those who haven't. I've spent 2 years in Iowa, and I got to know folks really well, and I got to know the process really well, and I got to understand that they, whether you agree with it or not, they take their position as first in the nation very seriously. This is something they feel a weight on their shoulders that they are responsible for kicking off a presidential race, and they are responsible for potentially choosing the next president of the United States. These are folks who have a very unique level of access that no other state will ever have. And they take that very seriously. And so I think anybody who talks about looks at the polling, who looks at Iowa and says, oh, well, DeSantis is up X number of points, or he's got 10,000 folks who are committed, signed caucus cards, and they're going to caucus for him in January. I'm laughing at them on the inside, because Iowans will not choose their candidate until like 2 weeks out, or even the day of. They will not make a decision because they view their role and their position as first in the nation that seriously. I think that Iowa is constantly a moving and shifting state. Same with New Hampshire, very different electorate, but they agree very much on that weight and that responsibility they carry. Whether you agree with it or not, that is something that they very deeply hold. And so I think that is an electorate that is going to constantly shift and shape and form even into December and as we get into January. So I think as folks kind of look at Iowa, I always say, remember and look at the last 3 presidential elections. The folks who were told that they had no shot in hell of winning the Iowa caucuses or even being in the top 3, those were the folks that came out on top. So I'm not saying that Donald Trump doesn't win the Iowa caucuses. I'm not going to say that. He's currently the front runner, and we all have to accept that. But I'm saying look at the results historically. That tells me something, that this race isn't set in stone, despite what anyone wants to say. Iowans are very fickle, and if Donald Trump continues to not campaign the way that he has it, if he continues to not show up, Iowans take that very seriously. Granite Staters take that very seriously, and they'll be paying attention. And then to John's point, I know you love Tim Scott, and I know that you kind of pointed to some of these folks who kind of have this Tim Scott embodiment of Mike Huckabees of the world, stuff like that. I will say the new Iowa is very different, and they love themselves a strong woman, and Joni Ernst and Kim Reynolds are a great example of that. And the fact that we have Marionette Miller Meeks and Ashley Hinson, I mean, that is a state that loves themselves a strong conservative woman. So if anyone has a good shot of taking Iowa home, I'm putting my money on Nikki Haley.
Well, and Iowa is such an interesting state, right? Because it's so relational. And the year that Santorum won Iowa was 2012. I was down there in fall of 2011, spring of 2012, leading up to that. And that guy was everywhere, right? Like if he had frequent flyer miles for Pizza Ranch, Rick Santorum would have gotten his name on the side of a restaurant type thing. But it's such an interesting relational state where you can kind of start to take a look and see who's spending time there, who's working their way around the counties, who's talking. And I was at an event, I think it might have been Lincoln Reagan, and Rick Santorum stood in that auditorium like 2.5 hours before the event started and had a conversation with every single person who walked up to him. And it is retail politics at its best. And I think it'll be really interesting to see who thrives in that environment. From what I've seen, it is not Ron DeSantis. But yeah, I could see absolutely, my dark horse who could do well in a state like that is Doug Burgum. He's a guy who could have a lot of those conversations and who could go spend a lot of time and who comes off as extremely authentic, whether you like what he has to say or not. He knows a lot of folks just like that. But I could see Nikki Haley doing well there. I could see Tim Scott doing well there. I think Iowa is and should remain wide open. But yeah, it's an interesting state, and yes, I agree that they have a lot of very strong, successful conservative women coming out of Iowa, and Minnesota could learn a thing or two.
Amen. I will say that your point about the retail politics, it's so important in a state like Iowa and New Hampshire. I remember when I first moved down there, I was told a story about Hillary Clinton going to this small town in Iowa. I think it was like southeast Iowa. And Donald Trump hadn't gone, but folks in that county remembered. And I think she flipped that county either in the caucus process or in the general election. And it was literally because she went and shook hands and did the speech and did her thing one time, and Donald Trump did not. And that is literally the difference maker. Do you show up or do you not? Iowans take the full Grassley very seriously. It's, Grassley started doing the 99 county tour. Every single followed up on that since, and they take it very seriously. Now it works for some and it doesn't work for others. John Delaney is a great example of that. In 2020, he did the full Grassley's twice and only got 5% of the vote. So you got to do it well, but if you do it right, you have a really good opportunity to make some difference in a state like Iowa.
Michael, what are your thoughts?
I think the state of the race is and I'll pivot to Iowa in a second. I think the state of the race is Donald Trump is still in the lead. I still think he's the presumptive nominee, and he's still. I think he has the ability right now to run a full national campaign. I think there's candidates right now that have regional opportunities, but I mean, and Iowa's significant, but also there's a history particularly inside the Republican Party, of not winning Iowa or winning Iowa and not becoming the nominee. I mean, Ted Cruz won it in 2016. Mike Huckabee won it in 2008. Bob Dole, I think, won it in 88. And so these are all candidates who won Iowa, but then later did not become the nominee. And so I think there is a path there. I think at some point on the Republican side, there needs to be a clear organizational number two to Donald Trump, and that needs to develop. My hope is that develops soon. My hope is that a Nikki Haley or some other candidate, others that have mentioned here, become a strong alternative. That's where I think this race needs to shape up. I still think right now it's Donald Trump's race to lose. My hope is that over the next coming weeks and months, organizationally, someone starts to develop a real one-on-one dynamic, a one-on-two dynamic with Donald Trump. I think starting off, I think a lot of people thought it was going to be DeSantis, but I just don't think he's up to the task. I don't think his campaign is up to the task. As someone pointed out, it may have been Preya, we're on multiple reboots here. And it's just, I don't think it's working. I don't think the reboots are working. And we all can probably cite examples of campaigns that went through reboots that were successful when they did reboots. And there's just something with DeSantis's operation that I don't think has taken off yet, and I don't think it's going to. So I think there's a path for a number two. And I think DeSantis is getting lapped very quickly. But the state of the race today, I still think it's Trump's to win. I still think he's the front runner, but I think there's an opportunity. But someone's got to get some momentum and start going here quickly, or this thing's going to be lost before we get too much farther down the road.
My quick comments on this are starting with a question. Walter, or Representative Hudson, you started out by saying you don't think or hope that Donald Trump does not respond, to any of these attacks that came out on the stage. I think, me personally, if I was working on his campaign, I would also say, don't mention them, don't bring attention to them. Do you think he has it within him to not? Or do you think the Donald Trump that we know and love is going to make sure that he comments back to everyone that mentioned him?
I mean, I could pull up Truth Social on another tab right now, and I guarantee you he's probably done something, right? No, it's very much in his nature to clap back at people when they clap at him, especially publicly. I think he would be well advised. And just to clarify, my hopes, my desires, I could care less what he does in response.
Right. I know.
but if I'm advising him, I would most definitely say, pretend these people don't exist, because for all functional purposes, they don't. This is not an impact. There is no center of gravity in the candidate field that was on that stage tonight that presents any threat to Trump's orbit. So why even talk about them? You know who you talk about? You talk about the people who are attacking you. You talk about the indictments. You talk about Biden. You talk about the Democrats, and they're taking the country in the wrong direction. You keep campaigning as if you're the guy, and you're going after that brass ring in the general election. There's no reason to talk about the Republican primary, because at the current moment, it only exists as a wonky phenomenon for folks like us to talk about on our podcasts.
Absolutely. My second comment is more just in general is we, on the podcast have very often talked about how, Trump's got this locked up. He's the candidate, it's just kind of the situation. I did get a Facebook message from a Minnesota activist who is, BPOU leader, has been very active on campaigns, who said, we need to work on how we're messaging, because if we keep continuing down that messaging path, folks are going to say, why do I show up then? Why do I show up and vote in the presidential primary? Why do I show up at the caucuses? Which now, polls are obviously very extreme. It's not like he's just leading by 1 to 5 points here, right? We're up by 30 some. But I do think there is something to that, on our side is if we're going to have any hope, is we need to make sure that the folks that do show up, that we do need to come out and vote in these primaries, do believe that there might be some tiny sliver of hope that one of these other candidates can get through. And what I'm hopeful from tonight is that, I've seen some really good donors, business leaders, established, which is such a dirty word these days, but, good, solid Republican leaders from decades past and years past, come out in support of some of these, the Chris Christies, the Nikki Haley's, and the like. And I think that I'm looking forward to seeing some of those names that maybe come out a little bit more vocally behind some of these candidates who performed well tonight and deserve to have a little bit of a boost, both financially and by some named people who are able to throw a little bit more weight by coming out, endorsing, hosting fundraisers and the sort. So I think that we will see some people get off the bench. I think there are some people that were maybe waiting in the wings and hopefully come out. So I think that will be interesting to see how that plays. So before we move in, fully lean into Trump world, any other comments on general state of the race?
Does anyone have a dark horse that they're waiting to see if they get in, or do we think that it's too late?
That is a
Is there
great
anything
question.
to Youngkin waiting to see how November goes and thinking about jumping in and sucking up some oxygen if nobody's been able to surge by then?
That is a great question. I don't have any on the top of mind. Youngkin, I guess, would be the one. I think I don't know, that I think he's doing a good thing of what he's doing, and get another term or two before he does that.
I think that they're Representative Hudson. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, from the perspective of somebody who has run for office and holds an office, if I try to put myself in the head of a potential person considering getting into this race past this point, the questions that I would be asking myself are things like, what do I hope to accomplish, and what is my path to victory in the nomination? And I think that there is a candidate who is currently representing each of the potential paths and vectors of attack that one could conceivably take against Donald Trump, and none of them have met with success. So if you're Youngkin or someone like that, I just don't know. What do you think? What are you thinking or plotting or imagining is going to be different about you, other than your face and your name, that's going to translate to bringing something to this race that isn't already currently represented by the field as it exists?
I also think if he waits until November, it's really late. He's going to have to work very quickly to not only get the donor money in, but he's also going to have to make sure that he's on the ballot in time, and he's going to have to campaign like crazy during the holidays when folks definitely don't want to be paying attention to politics. They're going to have to be paying it. They're going to have to be full speed ahead 24/7, trying to, make sure that they're hitting all the targets that they need to be doing, hitting all of these states, doing the retail politics to make sure that they don't embarrass themselves. Because if he does get in post-November, it's going to look really dumb on his part if he doesn't get more than 3 to 5% in the caucus or the primary. And then it becomes a question of, well, like, where does he go from here? Because he's had his one shot. Like, does he have is there some kind of downside effect that hits him after the fact? And that's going to be, part of that conversation as well.
Because he's term limited, right? He's done being governor. So this is kind of the last hurrah. If not this, then what? But yeah, it's a theory that had been thrown out to me, not too long ago of if DeSantis can't seem to unify people, if Tim Scott can't seem to unify, if nobody is, finding a way to get the kind of open to somebody who's not Trump factions of the party to coalesce around a candidacy, does somebody make sort of a Hail Mary play and say, we got to try something? And frankly, by that point, the race should be thinning out a little bit. Hopefully, we're starting to see some of those numbers kind of starting to boost up. Some people who are hovering down at 0 or 1 or 0.5% deciding that, okay, maybe this race isn't for me. Maybe we'll see Perry Johnson and Suarez drop out instead of threatening to sue the RNC. But it'll be interesting to see. But that's kind of the only thing that's been thrown out to me that I wonder, does that change anything, or is that just kind of, are people trying to wish cast somebody who's not Trump into existence out of sheer desperation at this point?
I would just tack on that I think that Youngkin entering the race, challenging DeSantis for number 2, would be very similar to the position that Vivek currently has of trying to be a mini Trump or a different version of Trump. Because the case for Youngkin, as I see it, is he's a governor who won in a blue state and has actually executed on policies that are important to conservatives in that previously blue state. That's a great argument. That's a great narrative. But DeSantis has that beat. Like, DeSantis is just won Florida by 20 points, a state that we can all remember was the state to watch on presidential election nights, because as Florida goes, so will likely go the race. It was very much a swing state. Now it's definitively red. DeSantis played a huge role in that, and he's been executing on policy left and right, and not just any policy, but the policies that are of greatest import to the grassroots, or at least that we say are of the greatest import to us. And so if there was a path to defeat Trump in this primary contest based upon the merits of governing, DeSantis wouldn't be as far behind Trump as he currently is. And so Youngkin coming in with not as great of a resume to put forward in that same type of contest, I don't think would have a whole lot of potential.
Do you have concerns about a red state governor who's passing some of the most typical red state kind of grassroots agendas, selling those to blue states, purple states, trying to get across the finish line and get to 270? As he's doing that, right? We're talking about how it's it was a swing state. It is now a red state. I don't think that anybody's under any illusions that Ohio and Florida still are swing states, right? Now we've got to think about places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Georgia, Arizona, to a lesser extent, Wisconsin and Minnesota. Colorado is not a swing state anymore. That is a blue state. So as we try and export, is there something to be said for a governor who's won in a blue state like a Chris Christie or a Glenn Youngkin, or somebody who's had the opportunity to campaign beyond those borders, or are we going to face challenges, especially in such a polarized environment, right, where we've got things that are here that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I would say, just you don't have to look any further than the borders of our own state. The Republican presidential candidate who's had the greatest success, if you want to characterize it as success, within the state of Minnesota in recent years has been Donald Trump, who is about as red meat red as you could possibly get.
He underperformed Romney, though, right? He got a lower percentage than Mitt Romney, right? It's just that Hillary Clinton underperformed every Democrat who's run.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's absolutely a fair point. And I don't have the ability on the fly here to control for that difference and determine what was better or worse. But what I will say is that Donald Trump was able to demonstrate, and yeah, Hillary's a terrible candidate, and that's probably a big part of the reason why Trump won in 2016 and did not prevail ultimately in 2020. But be that as it may, I don't think there's any denying that he reshaped, and maybe he personally didn't reshape it, but there was a reshaping on the verge of happening that his candidacy catalyzed, in terms of what the political playing field looks like and what the coalitions of the parties look like. I think you couple that, and this is kind of previewing, telescoping when we get into kind of our final analysis here. And so I'll just kind of summarize here and expound later. But I think when you couple that reshaping of the political landscape with taking into consideration the new electoral reality in terms of how elections work, and the fact that it's much less about messaging and a candidate's presentation and what a mailer looks like in somebody's mailbox, and much more about the physical operation of getting ballots in boxes. I think that physical on the ground operation of collecting ballots, getting them turned in, going back and collecting more, that is going to be the determining factor far more than who the candidate ultimately is.
And I'll say this too, if I can figure out how my mute button works. I will say that DeSantis isn't your typical red state governor either. I think that he and a lot of other folks like to say that he turned Florida red, and that's not necessarily true. Florida had been trending red a lot longer before DeSantis got onto the scene. But also, like, the Democrats abandoning Cuban immigrants who live in Miami-Dade County for a socialist agenda is what really helped flip a lot of what we're seeing now happening in Florida. When you look at Ron DeSantis, he is a candidate who has it very comfortably in Florida. He has a supermajority in the Florida legislature, and they will do whatever he asks them to, no questions asked. So he is able to pass a very red meat agenda. And so there's not a lot that he has to do in terms of a push and pull with folks. And so when you have to take that strategy and nationalize it at a time where Republicans have a 4-seat majority in the House, we do not have the Senate, and Joe Biden is president of the United States, that becomes a lot more difficult to manage. And for Ron DeSantis, he's going to have to work harder than ever before. And what we've seen so far is not necessarily that folks aren't necessarily not liking Ron DeSantis's policies. It's just that when they meet him, they realize they don't like him.
Wow. Finishing strong there. Michael, I think you had something before. I'm super, this is like just making my heart smile with this good conversation. But Michael, I think you had a comment before we moved on to the Trump.
I'll be very brief. We don't have an Eisenhower. So I think the race is set. I think everyone here has said everything much more eloquently than I could. I think the race is set. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Well, we're, nearing our hour and a half mark here, close to midnight. Want to be mindful of, maybe if anybody wants to get some sleep before work tomorrow. So let's close out here with a question about Donald Trump, or some more conversation about Donald Trump. Donald Trump had an interview tonight with Tucker Carlson. Started 5 minutes before the debate and started at 8:55. I'm going to throw some numbers at you here. 8:55 when it started, there were 967,000 viewerships of the interview. By 9 o'clock, when the debate had also started, 10.8 million. By 9:27, 72.9 million, and rounded out at 9:41 p.m. tonight with 73.9 million viewers. Those numbers are insane. He didn't need to show up to the debate. I'm impressed he actually stayed away from the debate, and he did exactly what he needed to do tonight. Now, I'm kind of putting everybody on the spot because unless you have, a second person, there's just no absolute no way that anybody was able to watch the interview and the debate and pay attention on Twitter and do all the things we did before this podcast. But what are our thoughts here? Can Trump win? Is Trump yes, okay, let's maybe if we all concede the fact that he is going to be the nominee, can Donald Trump win against Joe Biden or the Democrat candidate in November of 2024? Let's throw it who's up here. Let's throw it to John.
Oh man, putting me on the spot.
I like to.
Look, never say never. Politics is the art of the possible. I think that Donald Trump could beat Joe Biden. I do not think that he provides Republicans the best opportunity to beat Joe Biden, but that does not mean that he cannot beat Joe Biden. And regardless of how you feel about him, and this is something that I had to have a number of conversations with folks about, and yeah, I think it would be a mistake to say that he can't win. I don't think that the Democrats are going to operate in a world where they don't think that he can win. I think that they will throw everything that they can at him. But I don't think that he gives Republicans the best chance to win. And I think that this is an important election for us to find a way to get some guardrails back on the country, preferably through the White House. Ideally, we could get both of the chambers of commerce or houses of Congress and find a way. It's been a long day with a 1-year-old. I'll leave it at that.
All right, Preya.
I'll agree with John and say that never say never. I mean, 2016 taught us that. So I will say that. But I will also say if Donald Trump could beat Joe Biden, he would be president right now, not Joe Biden. And if Republicans thought he was a serious candidate and could take on Joe Biden in 2024, Ron DeSantis would not be running for president. Tim Scott would not be running for president. Nikki Haley would not be running for president, so on and so forth. So I think there is a serious problem. There are questions about electability and whether or not he can do it. No one wants a repeat of 2016.
Representative.
I alternate my two favorite podcasts right now, other than, of course, the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. I listen to Charlie Kirk almost every day, and I listen to Steve Deace almost every day. And the two of them are on exact opposite sides of the Trump DeSantis question. And so it's very interesting to consider their takes on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately, I think that they're both right. I think that Deace is right when he concludes that Donald Trump is near unelectable. Not because of any political analysis, but just because of the legal facts that I brought up earlier, the fact that they're going to do everything they possibly can to make it impossible for somebody to cast a vote for Donald Trump, let alone let him win. I also think that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. Like, I just don't think I don't see a path for anyone else becoming the nominee. And so realistically going forward, I think the focus has to be, what do the rest of us do? Those of us down ballot and those of us in the kind of activist commentator ecosphere, what do we do in light of that seeming inevitability? And the answer, to my mind, is we live faithfully with the mission that we have, which is to get elected in spite and to claim victories in spite of the fact that we are not necessarily going to have the most ideal candidate at the top of the ticket. And I would love to come back sometime and go into more depth in response to the two shows you guys did with former gubernatorial candidate Scott Jensen and some of the expert analysis you had in between there, which I thought were deeply fascinating conversations. But kind of the short preview of my reaction to that, and I already kind of teased it out earlier, this whole concern about candidate quality and messaging and how we appeal to independents and the suburban voters and this whole question of coming across as reasonable and all of these things. I think what that speaks to is electoral methodology that worked in the past. It worked when election day was a thing. It worked before all of the Soros-inspired Secretary of State changes to electoral laws, especially in our state here of Minnesota, where now we no longer have an election day. We have an election season, like way more than a month, right, of people casting ballots. And a big difference between 2020 and 2022 and 2024 is that in 2020 and 2022, the consensus amongst the Republican conservative ecosphere seemed to be that we weren't going to play elections by the rules as they had been changed, and that we were instead going to stomp our feet. And I was as guilty of this as anybody. We're going to stomp our feet and we're going to complain about how it's all rigged and how none of this should be the way it is, and we should do things completely differently, and it should be the way it used to be when I was growing up, and it was paper ballots and it was day of, and you had to be there in person, and by God, this is god awful. And so we're going to defy all of that by not participating. Well, it turns out when you don't participate in elections, you lose. And that's what happened last year. 20% of Republicans in the state didn't vote. You had tens of thousands of absentee ballots that were requested and not turned in. So I go back to, I don't think the name at the top of the ticket is going to matter as much next year as it has mattered in the past. What's going to matter is the extent to which we take lessons learned from our operational failures in recent cycles and commit ourselves to the task of getting ballots into boxes, and specifically getting ballots from people who would vote for us if they voted at all, but they simply do not vote. And when you break down what that task looks like, it takes a lot of investment in time, energy, and discussion to convince somebody in the middle that they should lean towards your guy when they might just as likely lean towards the other one. It doesn't take nearly as much investment of time and money and resources to convince somebody who will vote for your guy to just do it. And if that becomes the focus next year, then it might not matter whether or not Donald Trump's at the top of the ticket. We might win anyway.
All right, Michael, can he win?
I think I think there is a path for Donald Trump. I think it's a narrow path. I think there is a path for Donald Trump to win. For anyone to say that he can't win, I think isn't providing realistic analysis. I think it's tough for him to win. The problem I have with Donald Trump's, if he is the nominee, and I still believe he will be, is it makes it more difficult for Representative Hudson to get more colleagues in the Minnesota House of Representatives. I think it's more difficult for Republicans to win and pick up opportunities. And so I'm all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill said. So if I want Republicans to succeed in this state, and I want Republicans to take, for instance, to control back of the Minnesota House of Representatives, I find it very difficult to see how, if Donald Trump is at the top of the ticket, that he increases the likelihood of Republicans picking up the Minnesota House of Representatives. I think Donald Trump is an absolute cancer on other Republican candidates. And so I have a concern about that. And so if I want Representative Hudson to get more Republican colleagues in the House and give Minnesotans an example of what responsible leadership could be on the Republican side and help build towards winning statewide, I think I have to be an advocate. I have to not want Donald Trump to be the nominee, because I think it makes it more difficult. To Preya's point, I think Donald Trump's candidacy, I think, makes it more difficult for Republicans to win back the Senate, keep control of the House. And so we may get the presidency. There's a narrow path for him to win. So to John's point, I agree with him that there is a path for Trump. There is a path for Trump to win. I think it is a narrow path, and that's just the reality of the race. But my main point will be, I do think, particularly in Minnesota, if Trump is the nominee, it's more difficult for Republicans to get a foothold to win statewide, and that's the concern I have.
All right. Well, we are past our 90 minutes, so we're just going to throw it into closing. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening. I'm going to throw it around the horn one last time. Any final thoughts? And if you can also plug where folks can find you, website, Twitter, whatever you want to plug real quick. Let's go around. And Preya, you're up.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me on tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with y'all about the debates and everything that happened tonight. Y'all can find me over at K2 and Company, working with the great team over there doing political comms for everyone across the country, including SFA. So you can find us over there and check us out check me out on Twitter at Preya Samsundar. Thanks.
All right, Representative Hudson.
You can find me on Twitter at Walter Hudson. My campaign website is hudsonformn.com. That's all spelled out, hudsonformn.com. And my final thought would just be, again, kind of echoing where I left it, that I think the most important thing going into next year is not going to be the fun stuff, which is arguing over who the best candidate would be in some theoretical alternative universe, or arguing over what our resolutions or the content of our platform, or any of these things that activists love to argue about. The most important thing next year is going to be getting ballots into boxes. And that is the task that everybody needs to be committed to historically. To Michael's point regarding future potential colleagues of mine within the Republican caucus, the way that is going to happen is the same way it's happened in the past, which is by outperforming the top of the ticket, by having good local candidates who are running good local operations that get ballots into those boxes. That has to be the mission in 2024.
And John.
Thanks for having me on. It's been fun to discuss and get a couple of different insights on the debate. I'm hoping that the next debate that comes up is a little bit more inspiring. But it was good to kind of digest and talk about. And if folks want to follow, there's not a whole lot of content there, but at John_Rouleau for the occasional joke or snarky comment, and occasionally some pictures of barbecue. But thanks for having me on, and we'll chat with y'all soon.
Michael, any final words for our panelists or viewers or listeners?
I just want to say thanks to our panel for doing this tonight. This is our first live stream. This has been a real pleasure. I hope you guys will consider coming back. This was a great experience. You guys, all of you, offered tremendous insight. We appreciate you coming on. Becky, you did a fantastic job running this operation and moderating this entire panel. I just want to thank everyone for participating, and we hope to do this again. I hope you guys will all consider doing this again.
And you took my line. I was going to throw it up back to Michael real quick. He figured out how to do this live. He figured out all the graphics, how we can do this and stream across all the platforms. So mad props to Michael for making this happen. We look forward to doing more things like this again in the future. So with our closing here, we want to thank you all again for joining us at the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Pretty sure we probably could have gone for another hour or two with many other topics, issues we didn't even venture into or touch on. But the good news is we'll have another handful or 5 of debates coming up in the next year and a half or so. So we'll have plenty of opportunities. To all of you who stayed up and to tune in, we are grateful. Thank you. Be sure to share your comments on who you think did well in the debate, who dropped the ball, favorite moments. Tag at BB BreakPod. Continue to follow us at M Brodkorb and Allery RL. And thank you. Be sure to continue to listen to us, like us, follow, subscribe, give us ratings, all that good stuff. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.